Many people, I fall prey to obsessions, except I think I have an extremely obsessive personality. It's very simple and easy for me to get obsessed about something new and dive into it. And that can be a source of strength, but also a source of weakness. So let's talk a little bit about obsessions. There are macro obsessions and there are micro obsessions. Macro obsessions are about grander things going on in the world. Micro obsessions are about personal things. There are good obsessions and there are bad obsessions. Obsessions that are good for me, I call habits, maybe things like working out or meditating or reading. Bad obsessions, I call addictions that could range from smoking or drinking or pornography or sugar or drugs or any of the various traps that exist in society today. To seduce you and to take you away from doing the long-term things. Good micro-obsessions make you sacrifice the short-term for the long-term, and you don't hedonically adapt to them, and they're sort of more in line with our evolved nature rather than our modern society. The one area that I find especially dangerous is the macro-obsessions, even the so-called good ones. Even the causes, the climate change, the poverty, the fairness, the injustice, these can slowly drive you insane over time because here you can't really influence the outcome. So you have an unhealthy obsession. It's a never-ending pit. You can obsess about it forever, and it's very, very hard to make a difference. I would posit that pretty much all macro obsessions are bad simply because you can't influence them. They're going to be a source of stress and unhappiness. And the news is very pernicious in infecting us with macro obsessions. In fact, the news is best seen as a set of dueling narratives that are mind viruses trying to infect your brain to turn you into a zombie foot soldier fighting for their cause. If you actually took up every cause, and if you actually cared about everything that the news wants you to care about, you would go insane. This is not to say that one can't make a difference in life, but I would argue that if you actually want to make a difference and not just lose yourself in a series of macro obsessions, convert them to micro. If you care about the environment, plant a tree and tend to your garden. If you care about human emotional suffering, fix your relationships with your family. If you care about people's health, start by becoming a model of health yourself to inspire and then help others who are locally around you. If you care about poverty, lift someone next to you out of poverty. Take it on personally, rather than shouting, screaming, obsessing, watching. I, for one, have decided to be deliberate with my obsessions. I'm no longer going to fall prey to macro obsessions, and on the micro obsessions, I'm going to favor picking up the ones that are healthy for me and effective in giving me a better body and a calmer mind and a better family experience. And I'm going to be very careful about not picking up the micro obsessions that are going to lower the cost of dopamine in my life and make it too easy.
There's an interesting edge to walk here too. On the one hand, as you've just spoken about very eloquently, people can become overly obsessed with obsessions. They can find the thing that they're passionate about, the habit becomes an addiction, and it all goes bad. But there's also another way in which this idea of passions, habits, obsessions can go bad. This is common, I think, at all ages. You do see it in certain younger people. And unfortunately, I think you see it when people get older as well. And that's where they lack obsessions. They just don't have a passion. And I see this sometimes with people. They're going through the motions. They don't have particular interests that are motivating them. So there needs to be this line drawn between becoming overly addicted with certain things and becoming completely apathetic about life as well. And sometimes people need some sort of encouragement or push in the direction of trying to find out what their obsession might be. if I was forced to choose between someone who was absolutely obsessed by something to the point of an addiction in a particular, let's say, intellectual pursuit, or perhaps even fitness, let's say, which can happen, you know, of course, we know the people who become overly obsessed with fitness. I think that's a better problem to have than absolutely no interest in fitness and health whatsoever. You know, forced to choose, I'd rather be addicted to going to the gym than never going to the gym. They're both going to have their problems, but one of them is a worse evil. Of course, this is all a separate point to the main point you're making, which is to try to cultivate habits in your life that are going to not only be beneficial for you in health and wealth and wisdom, but which are also going to not lead you into addiction, not going to lead you into a place where you're wasting your time doing something purely for the dopamine hit, as you talk about there. What I also see, as I've hinted at there, is that some people don't get the dopamine hit unless they're going after, well, substances, unless they're going after chasing girls or boys, unless they're going after, you know, the thrills in the world. So how do we help cultivate in such people that I think many of us might know, where they don't have, forget obsession, they barely have interests, aside from perhaps sitting on the couch and watching the latest episode of whatever their favourite television show is. This could all point to an obsession of mine. I mean, you've talked about where people should place their attention, what kind of things are worth studying and worth focusing on and that kind of thing. And I also see that, and I think you agree, that there's just this untapped well of potential creativity out there in people. But people are being distracted constantly. There's this global distraction that's going on, as you talk about there with the media, as we can notice with social media, with pornography, with everything else, where if that was devoted to people finding out what their genuine interests are and pursuing those intellectually, the world's problems as they are would certainly be solved, revealing new problems at a much faster rate than what they are. Perhaps this is just a sort of transition phase that necessarily civilizations go through, this period of no one has any intellectual interests, to people are being distracted by the wrong kind of interests of the mind, and we will move into a phase change where people actually do realise there's a better way to exist in the world.
All macro obsessions are a derivative of the worldview that the purpose of humanity and your personal purpose is to perpetuate humanity into the future forever. Anytime somebody's trying to convince you that you have to change the way you live for future people, they are trying to give you a macro obsession. Curate your attention, or someone will do it for you.
I've quipped in the past that all morality boils down to choosing the long term over the short term. And so I think similarly in this case, a lot of the habits and addictions that we're talking about are about choosing long-term, slow-release, sustained dopamine as opposed to short-term, cheap dopamine hits. So how do we get there? Well, I'm not convinced one is necessarily right or wrong. If you want to sit there and watch TV and eat Cheetos for the rest of your life, I'm not going to judge you. But what I would say is that even though all of us have done that at various points in time or another's, some people manage to have the keen awareness that it does not deeply satisfy, and that there's always a hangover and there's always a come down, and they'll look for something more sustaining. So I think this is one of those cases where you have to get over the minimum activation energy of building a good habit or choosing a good hobby or choosing a worthwhile obsession. And then that will take you into a better place where you could not have reached through the short-term dopamine hit. And as Brett, you pointed out, we're seeing more and more people falling through the cracks with weaponized porn, with fentanyl addictions, with all kinds of easy, cheap social media thrills. So really the challenge is getting over that minimum activation energy into these good obsessions And perhaps some of that is upbringing and opportunities, perhaps some of that is admonishment. But I would argue most of it is just being self-analytical and having an awareness that the cheap dopamine hits don't really satisfy, don't really get you there, and don't keep you there. But they are hard to resist.
Yes, I've been struggling with macro obsessions as of late, primarily because things seem to be getting bad and changing very quickly and often, and it seems like we're heading in a new direction. And that's one part of it is these seeming new changes. Things are going to be different, but the other part of it is the areas in which I can actually control my outcome, depending on how the macro environment changes. And so the two ways in which I have to control it are, one, if I believe certain areas will be less prosperous or dangerous or more dangerous versus other areas which I believe will be more prosperous or less dangerous, I can physically move myself and my family, and I can choose my location. So that's one reason that it keeps bringing me back to look at it. And the other reason is that my industry, my business, how I make a living, all of that is also predicated on what happens in the macro environment, especially when there's massive changes and shifts in trends. And so that keeps bringing me back to it as well, just reorienting myself to the playing field as it's rapidly shifting on a, I believe, much larger scale than it normally does. So yeah, as this rolls kind of like unfolds, I do find myself lately having too many macro obsessions, and it is frustrating.
Perfectly valid, Tom. But if you're anything like me, you probably tend to overdo it. And the balance between macro and micro usually shifts to macro, mainly because the news media and other people around you are all caught up in macro and trying to make it your obsession as well. It's a shared obsession, so there are external forces pushing you towards it, whereas nobody's pushing you for the micro obsession except yourself.
These come to Jesus revelatory experiences always happen at the bottom of the cycle, never at the top. Isn't that interesting? But Tom, I think I understand exactly what you're saying, which is your professional and personal livelihood is intrinsically linked to the macro, and therefore you are trying to understand it better, trying to unpack it, trying to unbundle all the chaos and get to a point of truth, but you're already in the top 0.1% of your industry. That extra morsel of knowledge is probably not going to lead you to the promised land. And I think at some point you have to understand there could be a moment to quemar los barcos, which is burn the ships. Either decide you're going to do it, you're all in, or figure out where you're going to go next.
Brian, to your point about how these realizations tend to come at the bottom of the cycle, I think that's simply because as humans, we only take stock and introspect when suffering reveals the truth of what is, because you can't get away from the suffering. In fact, one of the best lines I've ever read was, "Pain demands a response." And that's true of physical pain, and that's true of emotional pain. So nothing like losing money to make you take stock of your current mental health situation and see the truth of it.
I could have just taken the wrong impression out of Naval's original chit-chat thread. I took it more like micro-obsessions are, you should keep them good and healthy, but and be mindful about them, but they were things that you could control about yourself, basically. And macro-obsessions were sort of getting depressed and anxious and focused on things that an individual just can't really impact, like global warming and political infighting, geopolitics, things like that. So, because to Tom's point, I absolutely feel like I need to be informed in my current career on those larger events, like what would normally be called macro events in that sense. That's just, being diligent about being an informed professional. But even then, you get the lay of the land and that's your obligation. But I try not to stay up too late thinking about it.